At 5:30 a.m. on April 9, 1942, Major General Edward King stood in a mango grove on the Bataan Peninsula in the Philippines, preparing to do something no American general had done since the Civil War. He was about to surrender an entire army. King had no way of knowing that his decision would condemn 75,000 men to the worst war crime committed against American soldiers in history. That only half would survive the next week. That the survivors would spend 3.5 years wishing they had died with the others. Behind King stood what remained of the Philippine-American forces that had held the Bataan Peninsula for 4 months. They weren't an army anymore. They were skeletons in rotting uniforms. Men with malaria, dysentery, beriberi, and dengue fever. Soldiers who had been on half rations since January, then quarter rations, then eating anything that moved. The defense of Bataan had been heroic. Against overwhelming odds, American and Filipino forces had held the line for 99 days after Pearl Harbor. They had bought time for Australia to fortify. Time for America to mobilize. Time that had to be purchased with their bodies. But time had run out. Japanese artillery was pulverizing the final American positions. The front lines had collapsed. Hospitals overflowed with wounded men who couldn't be treated because there were no medical supplies. The last food had been distributed 3 days ago. Soldiers were too weak to hold their rifles. General Douglas MacArthur had evacuated to Australia 6 weeks earlier, ordered out by President Roosevelt. Before leaving, he'd made a promise to the men on Bataan, "I shall return." He'd also made a prediction: relief would arrive soon. Reinforcements were coming. Supply ships were on the way. It was all lies. MacArthur knew no reinforcements were coming. The Philippines were written off. The men on Bataan were expendable, sacrificed to buy time. Their commander abandoned them knowing they would be captured or killed, but needing them to hold out as long as possible. The soldiers didn't know this. They believed MacArthur's promise. They held the line waiting for ships that were never dispatched, for relief forces that were never assembled, for a rescue that was never planned. Now they were out of time, out of ammunition, and out of hope. At 12:30 p.m., General King met Lieutenant General Masaharu Hama of the Japanese 14th Army. King tried to negotiate terms of surrender. He asked for assurances that his men would be treated according to the Geneva Convention, that the wounded would receive medical care, that prisoners would be given food and water. Hama's staff refused to negotiate. Japan had not signed the Geneva Convention. American prisoners would receive whatever treatment Japan deemed appropriate. King had no choice. He signed the surrender at 3:30 p.m. 75,000 men became prisoners of war in that moment. 12,000 Americans, 63,000 Filipinos, the largest surrender of U.S. forces in history. The Japanese army was not prepared for this many prisoners. They had expected 25,000 at most. They had planned for a quick collapse, not a 4-month siege that had cost them 12,000 casualties. The Japanese soldiers were exhausted, angry, and in no mood for mercy. Japanese military culture viewed surrender as the ultimate dishonor. A soldier's duty was to fight to the death. Surrender meant you had abandoned your honor, your emperor, your very humanity. Prisoners of war were not men anymore. They were something less than human, unworthy of the considerations granted to soldiers. The Japanese guards looked at 75,000 surrendered enemy troops and saw cowards, weaklings. Men who deserved contempt, not compassion. The decision was made to march all prisoners north to Camp O'Donnell, a facility 65 miles away. The march would begin immediately. No food would be provided. Water would be available when convenient for the guards. Medical care would not be offered. Any prisoner who could not keep up would be left behind. On the morning of April 10, 1942, the march began. Private Lester Tenney was among the first group to start walking. He had been sick with malaria for 2 weeks. His uniform hung loose on a body that had lost 40 pounds. He had no canteen, no food, no idea where he was being taken. The Japanese guards organized the prisoners into groups of 100 and began marching them north along the East Road, the main highway up the Bataan Peninsula. The temperature was 94 degrees. Humidity approached 100%. The road was exposed, no shade, just open pavement under the tropical sun. The prisoners walked. Within the first mile, men began collapsing. The 4 months of starvation and disease had left them with no reserves. Their bodies were consuming themselves. Walking in the heat while dehydrated and malnourished triggered cascading failures in cardiovascular and metabolic systems. Men fell face first onto the pavement and didn't get up. The Japanese guards had been given clear instructions. The march would maintain pace. Stragglers would not delay the column. Any prisoner who fell behind would be dealt with immediately. When the first American soldier collapsed at the side of the road, his friends tried to help him. They lifted him to his feet, put his arms over their shoulders, tried to carry him forward. A Japanese guard ran over and screamed at them in words they didn't understand. The guard raised his rifle and drove the bayonet through the fallen soldier's chest. He twisted the blade and pulled it out. Blood poured onto the road. The guard pointed at the other prisoners and screamed again. The message was clear: keep moving or die. The march continued. Tenney watched men die every 100 yards. The pattern was always the same. A soldier would stumble, try to catch himself, fail. He would hit the ground and attempt to stand. If he couldn't rise within seconds, a guard would approach. Sometimes they used bayonets, sometimes rifle butts to the skull. Sometimes they simply shot the fallen prisoner in the back of the head and kept walking. The bodies were left where they fell. By the end of the first day, the East Road was lined with corpses. The guards allowed one 10-minute rest stop every 6 hours. During these stops, prisoners collapsed in the road and didn't move. Some fell asleep immediately. Others simply lay there, staring at nothing, too exhausted to process what was happening. Water was the obsession that consumed every thought. The tropical heat was pulling fluid from their bodies faster than human physiology could manage. Their tongues swelled, their lips cracked and bled, their vision blurred. On the afternoon of the first day, the column passed a roadside well, clean water, right there, 20 feet from the road. Men broke ranks and ran for it. The Japanese guards opened fire. Machine gun bullets tore through the prisoners crowding around the well. Men fell into the water, their blood spreading across the surface. Others were cut down before they reached it. A few managed to scoop handfuls of water into their mouths before being bayoneted from behind. The guards herded the surviving prisoners back onto the road. The march continued. Behind them, bodies floated in the well. That night, 15,000 prisoners were packed into a barbed wire enclosure the size of a football field. No shelter, no latrines, no water. Men slept pressed against each other, unable to move. Those with dysentery couldn't make it to the edge of the enclosure in time. They soiled themselves where they lay. The guards patrolled the perimeter. Anyone who approached the wire was shot. In the darkness, Sergeant Harold Fainer listened to men around him dying, some from their wounds, others from dehydration or disease. A few simply gave up. They closed their eyes and stopped fighting. By morning, hundreds of bodies lay scattered throughout the enclosure. The living separated themselves from the dead and waited for the march to resume. Day 2 began at dawn. The sun rose over the South China Sea and turned the Bataan Peninsula into an oven. The temperature climbed past 100 degrees by 9:00 a.m. The prisoners had been given no food since surrender, no water except what they could steal or beg. Their bodies were cannibalizing muscle tissue for energy. Organ systems were beginning to shut down. They walked anyway because the alternative was a bayonet in the back. The column passed through Filipino villages. Civilians lined the road, holding out water, rice balls, pieces of fruit. They were trying to help the prisoners, to give them anything that might keep them alive. The Japanese guards beat the civilians back with rifle butts. They smashed the water containers. They kicked the food into the dirt. Any civilian who persisted in trying to help prisoners was shot in front of their families. The march continued. Private Blair Robinett watched a man ahead of him pull a piece of hardtack from his pocket, something he'd saved from before the surrender. The man lifted the cracker to his mouth. A guard saw him eating and ran over, screaming. The guard smashed the prisoner's face with his rifle butt, breaking his jaw. Then he bayoneted the man in the stomach and left him writhing on the road. The message was clear. Everything belonged to Japan now. Even food prisoners had carried themselves. Eating without permission meant death. By the afternoon of the second day, the march had become a procession of the dying leading the dead. Men walked in a trance state, their minds shutting down to protect themselves from the horror. They put one foot in front of the other because that was all they could do. Thinking about the distance remaining would break them. Thinking about the men dying around them would break them. So they didn't think, they just walked. Some prisoners tried to help their friends. When a man collapsed, his buddies would grab him under the arms and drag him forward, hoping he would recover enough to walk again. Sometimes it worked, usually it didn't. Corporal Wayne Carringer was helping carry a fellow Marine who had collapsed from heat stroke. They made it perhaps 50 yards before a guard noticed. The guard approached and gestured for them to drop the unconscious Marine. Carringer refused. The guard raised his rifle. Carringer still didn't let go. The guard shot the unconscious Marine through the head. Then he turned the rifle on Carringer. Carringer dropped his friend's body and kept marching. That night he sat in another crowded enclosure and tried to understand what he'd witnessed. A man executed for being too weak to walk. Guards who showed no more emotion about killing than about swatting flies. A nightmare that continued hour after hour with no end in sight. Around him, men were losing their minds. Some talked to people who weren't there. Others laughed at nothing, the sound high and broken. A few tried to walk through the barbed wire and were shot by guards. Carringer closed his eyes and tried to sleep. Tomorrow they would walk again, and men would die again, and the guards would show no mercy again, because this wasn't war anymore. This was extermination at walking pace. Day 3, the sun, the heat, the endless road north. By now, thousands of men had died. The exact number was impossible to calculate because the Japanese kept no records and the prisoners were too exhausted to count. Bodies lined both sides of the East Road for miles. Some had been dead for days, bloating in the tropical heat. Others were fresh, still bleeding into the dirt. The living walked past the dead and felt nothing. Emotional capacity had been exhausted along with physical reserves. Death was so common that it no longer registered as tragedy. It was just what happened. Men fell, guards killed them. The march continued. Water became the only thing that mattered, not food, not rest, not rescue, just water. Men would do anything for water. They licked moisture from leaves. They drank from mud puddles. Some drank from carabao wallows, stagnant pools filled with animal feces and parasites. They knew it would make them sick. They drank anyway because thirst was driving them insane. Private Albert Brown watched a prisoner break from the column and run toward a stream. The guards shot him before he reached it. His body fell at the water's edge, close enough to touch the stream but unable to drink. Other prisoners watched and understood the equation. Run for water, guaranteed death. Keep marching, probable death. The only rational choice was to keep walking and hope, but hope was in short supply. The guards seemed to delight in the cruelty. They would march the column past wells and streams without stopping. making the prisoners watch water they couldn't access. They would drink from their own canteens in front of dehydrated men, pouring excess water onto the ground. Some guards took it further. They would pull a prisoner from the column at random and beat him for entertainment. They would force prisoners to kneel in the sun for hours as punishment for imagined offenses. They would bayonet men who looked at them wrong. The systematic cruelty wasn't policy from headquarters. It was individual guards expressing contempt for prisoners they viewed as subhuman. Every guard had lost friends during the 4-month siege of Bataan. Every guard was exhausted and angry. The prisoners were convenient targets for that rage, and there was no one to stop it. No officers enforcing discipline. No military police ensuring humane treatment. Just guards with bayonets and prisoners too weak to resist. On the 4th day, the march reached the town of Lubao. Here, some prisoners were loaded onto railroad cars for transport to Camp O'Donnell. Others continued walking. The boxcars were designed to hold 40 men. The Japanese packed 100 plus into each car. Men stood pressed against each other, unable to move, unable to breathe in the stifling heat. The steel boxcars became ovens under the tropical sun. When the train finally arrived at Kappa's station after 4 hours, the guards opened the doors to find men dead from heat stroke and suffocation. Their bodies held upright by the pressure of living men packed around them. The survivors were unloaded and forced to march another 8 miles to Camp O'Donnell. Those who had continued walking from Lubao faced a different nightmare. The road became steeper, climbing into the hills. Men who had somehow survived 4 days of marching on flat ground couldn't handle the incline. They collapsed in waves. The guards grew impatient with the slow pace. They began executing prisoners in groups. 10 men fell behind, lined them up and bayonet all of them, easier than dealing with stragglers individually. Sergeant William Dice watched guards dig a shallow trench beside the road, force prisoners to kneel at the edge, then behead them with samurai swords. The bodies were kicked into the trench. The guards moved to the next group. Some prisoners tried to escape during the confusion. They would slip into the jungle at night or fall behind the column and hide. A few succeeded. Most were caught and executed publicly to discourage others from trying. Those who attempted escape knew the risk. They also knew that staying in the column meant certain death, just slower. Some men preferred to take the chance. Private Glenn Frazier tried to escape on the 5th night. He managed to hide in dense vegetation as the column passed. He waited until the guards moved on, then started crawling south, hoping to reach friendly Filipino guerrillas. He made it 3 miles before a Japanese patrol found him. They beat him unconscious with rifle butts, dragged him back to the road, and crucified him on a fence post as a warning. They used barbed wire to bind his arms to the crossbeam and left him hanging in the sun. Frazier survived. Filipino civilians cut him down after the Japanese left and hid him until American forces returned in 1945. But most men who tried to escape weren't so lucky. After 6 days of marching, the survivors reached Camp O'Donnell. Of the 75,000 men who had surrendered at Bataan, approximately 54,000 reached the camp. The rest, 21,000 men, died along the road. Shot, bayoneted, beheaded, or simply worked to death by exhaustion and disease. The march came to be known as the Bataan Death March, one of the worst war crimes committed against American forces in history. But for the survivors, the nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning. Camp O'Donnell was never designed to hold 50,000 plus prisoners. It had been a Philippine Army training facility with capacity for perhaps 10,000. The Japanese had done nothing to expand it. No additional barracks, no sanitation facilities, no medical infrastructure. The prisoners were crammed into bamboo huts with leaking roofs and dirt floors. 400 men per building designed for 40. No beds, no mosquito netting, no latrines except open trenches that overflowed within days. Water came from a single spigot that produced a trickle. Men waited in line for hours to fill a canteen. By the time they reached the spigot, other prisoners had collapsed from dehydration while waiting. Food consisted of a handful of rice twice a day, sometimes contaminated with weevils and rat droppings. Not enough calories to sustain a sedentary man, let alone prisoners recovering from a 6-day death march. The combination of malnutrition, contaminated water, lack of sanitation, and tropical diseases created a death trap. Men died in hundreds every day. Dysentery, malaria, beriberi, diphtheria, dengue fever. Diseases spread through the camp like wildfire through dry grass. The Japanese provided no medical care. American doctors tried to help with no supplies, no medicine, no equipment. They watched men die from easily treatable conditions because they had nothing to treat them with. Every morning, burial details would collect the bodies of prisoners who had died overnight. They would carry them to mass graves outside the camp and throw them in. No ceremony, no markers, no record of who was buried where. In the first 2 months at Camp O'Donnell, 1,500 Americans died. 20,000 Filipinos died. The camp became a mass grave with living prisoners waiting their turn. Private Lester Tenney, who had survived the march, watched men around him give up. They would stop eating, stop drinking, stop moving. They would lie down in the barracks and close their eyes and wait to die. Sometimes it took days, sometimes hours. Tenney understood the impulse. The suffering seemed endless. The guards were still brutal. The conditions were still inhuman. Death offered escape from all of it, but Tenney refused to give up. He had made a promise to himself during the march. He would survive, and he would testify. Someone had to live to tell the world what happened. Someone had to remember the names of the men who died. He survived Camp O'Donnell. He survived being transferred to other camps. He survived 3.5 years as a POW, enduring forced labor, beatings, starvation, and disease. He survived to tell the story. In September 1945, American forces liberated the POW camps across the Philippines. Of the 75,000 men who had surrendered at Bataan, fewer than 54,000 had survived the march to reach Camp O'Donnell. Of those, only 35,000 lived to see liberation. 19,000 died in the camps over 3 years of captivity. The total death toll, approximately 40,000 men, more than half of those who surrendered. The survivors came home weighing 80 or 90 pounds, their bodies destroyed by years of starvation and disease. Some recovered physically. None recovered mentally. They had nightmares for decades. They couldn't talk about what they'd experienced. Many turned to alcohol to silence the memories. Others simply withdrew from the world, unable to reconcile the men they'd been with what they'd become. After the war, the United States conducted war crimes trials. General Masaharu Hama, who had commanded the Japanese forces on Bataan, was tried for the Death March. He claimed he had not ordered the atrocities, that he hadn't even known they were occurring. Evidence suggested otherwise. Reports had reached his headquarters. He had done nothing to stop it. Hama was found guilty and executed by firing squad on April 3, 1946. Other guards and officers involved in the march were tried and executed, but most of the individual guards who had committed the murders were never identified, never charged, never punished. The families of the dead received telegrams informing them their sons or husbands had been killed in action. No details about how they died. No explanation of the suffering they'd endured. Many families never learned the full truth. The government classified detailed reports about the death march for years, not wanting to inflame public opinion or complicate post-war relations with Japan. The survivors were ordered not to speak publicly about their experiences. Some obeyed, others couldn't remain silent. Lester Tenney spent decades speaking about the Bataan Death March. He testified before Congress. He wrote books. He gave interviews. He made it his mission to ensure the world remembered. He fought for recognition for the survivors, for compensation for the years stolen from them, for acknowledgement of what they'd endured. In 1999, Japanese Prime Minister Kizo Abuchi expressed deep remorse for the suffering caused to prisoners of war. It was the closest Japan came to an official apology. It wasn't enough. But it was something. Lester Tenney lived until 2017. He was 96 years old when he died, one of the last survivors of the Bataan Death March. With his death, another witness to one of history's greatest war crimes was silenced. But the testimony remains. The records exist. The photographs survive. 75,000 men surrendered on April 9, 1942. 21,000 died on a 6-day march through hell. 19,000 more died in the camps that followed. They died because surrender was viewed as dishonor, because guards showed no mercy, because bureaucratic failures left them with no rescue, because the world was fighting a war and their suffering was considered acceptable collateral damage. Their story demands to be remembered. Not because it's comfortable, not because it's inspiring, but because 40,000 men died screaming for water on a road in the Philippines, and the least we can do is say their names. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Every like tells YouTube to share this with more people who need to hear it. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We bring you forgotten history every single day. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. These men died far from home. The least we can do is remember them from wherever we are in the world. 75,000 men began that march. Most never came home. Thank you for watching. Thank you for making sure the Bataan Death March is not forgotten.